The Tenerife Airport Disaster. On March 27, 1977, two Boeing 747 aircraft collided on a runway in the Canary Islands, killing 583 people and making it the deadliest accident in aviation history. It did not happen in the air. It happened on the ground in thick fog, on a single runway that both planes were sharing. A series of miscommunications between pilots and air traffic control, combined with poor visibility and the pressure to depart quickly, led KLM Flight 4805 to begin its takeoff run, while Pan Am Flight 1736 was still taxiing on the same runway. By the time either crew realized what was happening, there was no time to stop. The KLM aircraft clipped the Pan Am plane and both caught fire. Only 61 people survived, all from the Pan Am flight. The disaster completely changed how aviation communication is handled worldwide, replacing informal language with strict, standardized phraseology that is still required today. The crash of Japan Airlines Flight 123. On August 12, 1985, a Boeing 747 operated by Japan Airlines lost control shortly after takeoff from Tokyo and crashed into a remote mountain range, killing 520 people. It remains the deadliest single aircraft accident ever recorded. The cause was traced back to a repair made 7 years earlier, when airline engineers improperly fixed a damaged rear pressure bulkhead. Over hundreds of flights, that repair slowly failed until it ruptured mid-flight, destroying the tail section and severing all hydraulic lines. The crew fought for 32 minutes to control the plane, using nothing but engine thrust, managing to keep it airborne far longer than most expected. The crash site was not reached until the following morning. 4 people survived. The accident exposed serious failures in maintenance oversights and led to sweeping changes in how constructional repairs on commercial aircraft are inspected and approved. The Lockerbie Bombing. On December 21, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over the Scottish town of Lockerbie while cruising at 31,000 feet, killing all 259 people on board and 11 more on the ground. It was not an accident. A bomb hidden inside a radio cassette player had been loaded onto the aircraft inside a suitcase, and it detonated over southern Scotland. Large sections of the plane, including most of the fuselage, fell directly onto the town below. The attack was later attributed to Libyan intelligence operatives. One man, Abdelbasset El-Megrahi, was convicted in 2001. The bombing fundamentally changed airport security around the world, accelerating the use of baggage matching systems that ensure no checked luggage flies on a plane without its owner on board. It remains one of the most significant acts of aviation terrorism ever carried out. The crash of American Airlines Flight 191. On May 25, 1979, a Douglas DC-10 departing from Chicago O'Hare Airport lost its entire left engine on the runway during takeoff and crashed seconds later, killing all 273 people on board and 2 people on the ground. The engine did not fail in the traditional sense. It physically separated from the wing, taking a section of the hydraulic and electrical systems with it. The crew had no indication of what had just happened, and the aircraft's nose began rising in a way the pilots could not counteract. Within moments, the plane rolled, stalled, and went down in a field near the airport. Investigators found the engine had been damaged during a maintenance procedure that used a forklift in a way the manufacturer had explicitly prohibited. The accident led to a temporary grounding of all DC-10 aircraft in the United States and remains one of the deadliest aviation accidents on American soil. The crash of Air France 447. On June 1, 2009, an Airbus A330 flying from Rio de Janeiro to Paris disappeared over the Atlantic Ocean in the middle of the night and was not found for nearly 2 years. All 228 people on board were killed. The aircraft had flown into a storm system, and its airspeed sensors, called pitot tubes, iced over and gave conflicting readings. When the autopilot disconnected, the crew became confused about the plane's actual speed and attitude. In the chaos that followed, one of the pilots pulled back on the controls when the correct response was to push forward, sending the aircraft into an aerodynamic stall from which it never recovered. The black boxes were not recovered from the ocean floor until 2011. The accident revealed serious gaps in how pilots are trained to handle sudden automation failures, particularly at high altitude, where there is little time and little room for error. The crash of TWA Flight 800. On July 17, 1996, a Boeing 747 exploded and fell into the Atlantic Ocean shortly after takeoff from New York, killing all 230 people on board. Hundreds of witnesses on the ground saw the explosion and reported seeing a streak of light rising toward the aircraft before it broke apart, which immediately led to intense speculation that the plane had been shot down. A 4-year investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the cause was an explosion inside the center fuel tank, triggered by faulty wiring. The streak of light witnesses saw was actually burning jet fuel falling from the aircraft after the initial explosion. The investigation became one of the longest and most expensive in aviation history, and its findings led to significant redesigns in how fuel tanks are constructed and ventilated on commercial aircraft. The crash of ValueJet Flight 592. On May 11, 1996, a DC-9 operated by ValueJet Airlines plunged into the Florida Everglades just 11 minutes after taking off from Miami, killing all 110 people on board. The cause was oxygen generators that had been improperly loaded into the cargo hold. The generators were supposed to have their safety caps installed before being shipped, but they weren't. They activated in the hold, started a fire, and the fire spread faster than the crew could respond. The plane went into a steep dive and hit the swampy ground at high speed. Recovery of the wreckage and human remains from the Everglades was an extraordinarily difficult operation. The crash exposed serious problems with how budget carriers in the United States managed maintenance and cargo handling, and it directly contributed to stricter oversight of low-cost airlines during the rapid expansion of that industry in the 1990s. The crash of Korean Airlines Flight 007. On September 1, 1983, a Boeing 747 carrying 269 passengers and crew was shot down by a Soviet military jet over the Sea of Japan after the aircraft accidentally flew into Soviet airspace. The aircraft had deviated significantly from its planned route due to a navigational error that went unnoticed for hours. Soviet air defense tracked the aircraft and, believing it to be a spy plane, scrambled fighters. After attempting to signal the crew with no response, a Soviet Su-15 fired 2 missiles and the plane went down. All on board were killed. The incident occurred at the height of Cold War tensions and caused an international crisis. Among those killed was a sitting United States congressman. The tragedy had a lasting consequence that most people have benefited from without knowing it. It prompted President Ronald Reagan to make the GPS satellite system, then used only by the military, available for civilian use. The crash of United Airlines Flight 232. On July 19, 1989, a DC-10 suffered a complete failure of its tail-mounted engine over Iowa, sending shrapnel through all 3 of the aircraft's hydraulic systems simultaneously. Without hydraulics, the crew had no conventional way to steer or control the aircraft. What followed was one of the most extraordinary feats of airmanship ever recorded. The captain enlisted the help of a flight instructor who happened to be traveling as a passenger, and together, the crew learned to control the plane using only the thrust of the 2 remaining wing engines. They managed to reach a regional airport in Sioux City and attempt an emergency landing. The aircraft broke apart and caught fire on the runway, but 185 of the 296 people on board survived. The accident was considered unsurvivable by pre-existing standards, and the survival rate reshaped how emergency evacuation procedures, seat design, and cabin crew training are approached worldwide. The crash of Swiss Air Flight 111. On September 2, 1998, an MD-11 flying from New York to Geneva declared an emergency off the coast of Nova Scotia and crashed into the Atlantic, killing all 229 people on board. 16 minutes before impact, the crew smelled smoke in the cockpit. They descended to find a suitable airport and began dumping fuel. While doing so, a fire was spreading inside the roof of the aircraft, burning through wiring and systems the crew could not see or reach. Before they could land, the cockpit lost power and the aircraft went down near Peggy's Cove, a small fishing community. The fire was traced to in-flight entertainment wiring that had not been tested adequately for flammability. The crash led to one of the most sweeping reviews of aircraft wiring materials in history and resulted in major changes to how electrical insulation in commercial aircraft is certified. The crash of Air India Flight 182. On June 23, 1985, a Boeing 747 was destroyed by a bomb planted by Canadian Sikh extremists and fell into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Ireland, killing all 329 people on board. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in Canadian history, and for a time, the deadliest act of aviation terrorism in the world. The bomb had been loaded onto the plane inside a suitcase that had been transferred from a connecting flight, and its owner was not on board. Canadian intelligence had received warnings about a potential attack, but the information had not led to adequate preventative action. The investigation that followed was plagued by delays, lost evidence, and legal complications that stretched on for decades. Only one man was ever convicted in connection with the bombing. The disaster exposed catastrophic failures in how security agencies in Canada shared intelligence and enforced baggage security protocols. The crash of Concorde Air France Flight 4590. On July 25, 2000, the only fatal crash in the history of the Concorde supersonic jet occurred when a Continental Airlines DC-10 dropped a metal strip on a runway at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. Minutes later, the Concorde ran over it during takeoff. The strip punctured a tire, and the debris struck the underside of the wing with enough force to send a shockwave through the fuel tank, which ruptured and ignited. The aircraft took off already on fire, struggled to gain altitude, and crashed into a hotel near the airport. All 109 people on board and 4 on the ground were killed. The Concorde was grounded and later modified before returning to service, but the crash, combined with declining passenger numbers after the September 11 attacks the following year, contributed to the aircraft's permanent retirement in 2003.